Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt of the yard, the sound a dull, final thud in the vast, indifferent silence of the high country. The dust, the color of rust and regret, rose in a lazy puff around the worn leather, then settled again, as if the intrusion was already forgotten. Beside her, her daughter, Elara, stood with the unnerving stillness of a frightened deer, her small hand clutching a fold of Cora's skirt. Elara's eyes, a dark and solemn blue, took in the scene. A long, low ranch house with a sagging porch, a massive barn whose roof looked like a tired old spine, and corrals that seemed held together by little more than habit. The whole place looked exhausted, bleached by a sun that gave light, but no warmth. It was a landscape that had long ago decided it was not in the business of forgiveness. She had walked the last 6 miles, the station master's vague directions echoing in her head. Quinn's place? Keep the broken ridge to your left. You'll think you've gone too far. Then you'll go a mile more. He had looked at her, at the child, at their meager luggage, and a flicker of pity had crossed his face before he'd turned away. Pity was a currency Cora could no longer afford to trade in. It was heavy, and she had nothing left to carry. What she had was the $112 sewn into the hem of her dress, a knowledge of cattle and accounts that had once run a ranch twice this size, and a daughter who had not spoken a word of English since her father's grave was filled. A man emerged from the barn, moving with the stiff, deliberate gait of someone whose body kept a meticulous record of past injuries. He was tall and broad in the shoulder, but there was a hollowness to him, as if he were a framework for the man he used to be. A brutal scar, old and white, cut a path from his left temple, catching the corner of his eye and pulling it into a permanent, skeptical squint before disappearing into a thick, untrimmed beard that was more gray than brown. His eyes, the one untouched and the one narrowed by scarred tissue, were the flat, hard gray of creek stones after a long drought. He stopped 20 feet away, wiping his hands on a rag that looked as tired as the rest of the ranch. He did not look at her bags. He did not look at the child. He looked at her face, and his expression was one of profound, unyielding doubt. "Lost?" he asked. His voice was a rasp, like stones grinding together. It was not a question of concern, it was an accusation. Cora straightened her shoulders, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Her entire life had been a process of learning to stand up straight when everything inside her wanted to fold. "I'm looking for Mr. Eamon Quinn," she said, her own voice clearer and steadier than she felt. "You found him," he said. The words offered no welcome. He made no move to close the distance between them. "I'm not hiring, and I'm not in the market for whatever you're selling." Cora had practiced this moment in her mind for 1,000 sleepless nights. She had imagined pleading, she had imagined weeping, she had imagined turning back. But standing here, in the raw, aching light of the afternoon, with the weight of her daughter's silence beside her, she found a different reservoir to draw from. It was not hope. It was the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. "I'm not asking you to hire me," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And I have nothing left to sell. My name is Cora Halloran. This is my daughter, Elara. My husband is dead. Our ranch in the Panhandle is gone. I can cook, I can clean, I can keep books. I can mend tack, and I know a sick calf from a lazy one. I am not looking for charity. I am looking for a roof, and I will earn it." The man, Eamon Quinn, crossed his arms over his chest. It was a gesture of absolute closure. "I've had cooks before. They drink my whiskey, burn my food, and leave when the work gets hard. I've had bookkeepers. They cook the books and run off with what little there is. The West is full of widows with sad stories, madam. This ranch has no room for another 1 inch." His dismissal was so complete, so final, it was almost a physical force. Cora felt it press against her, urging her to pick up her bags and retreat back down the long, dusty track. She could feel Elara trembling beside her. She looked down at the top of her daughter's head, at the dark, fine hair, and the familiar, desperate fire ignited in her chest. She had not come this far to be turned away by a man who was too broken to see past his own scars. Just then, a commotion erupted from a nearby corral. A young man, barely more than a boy, shouted in alarm. "Boss, it's the bull. He's down." Quinn's head snapped toward the sound. The rigid set of his shoulders broke, replaced by a surge of panicked energy. He swore, a low, vicious sound, and started running toward the corral, his limp more pronounced in his haste. Another 2 men came spilling out of the bunkhouse, their faces etched with concern. Cora, without a second thought, grabbed Alara's hand. "Stay right here," she commanded softly. Then she followed the men, her worn boots sinking into the churned-up dirt. Inside the corral, a massive Hereford bull lay on its side, its great chest heaving. Its eyes were wide and rolling, and a frothy foam flecked its muzzle. The young hand, a boy with a shock of blonde hair and a dusting of freckles, was kneeling beside it, looking helpless. "He was fine this morning, Mr. Quinn. I swear he was. He just went down." An older, grizzled hand with a sour expression spat a stream of tobacco juice. "It's the bloat. Same as what took the Miller herd last spring. He's a goner." Eamon Quinn stood over the animal, his face a mask of grim fury and despair. Cora could see it in the clenching of his jaw, the white-knuckled grip of his hands. This bull was not just an animal. It was an investment. It was hope. It was the future of the herd, lying in the dust, dying. "Get the trocar," he bit out, but his voice was hollow. He knew, and they all knew, it was likely too late. Cora pushed past the young hand. She didn't ask for permission. She dropped to her knees beside the bull's great, shuddering head, her hands moving with a sureness that was startling in the midst of the men's frantic helplessness. She ran a hand over the animal's taut, drum-like flank. She peeled back its eyelid, looked at the pale membrane. She sniffed the air around its mouth. The men fell silent, watching her. Even Quinn stopped, his hard eyes narrowed on her hands, on the confidence of her touch. "It's not bloat," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Look at his eyes. No cherry red. And the smell? It's not fermentation." She pressed her fingers firmly into the muscle of the bull's neck, then moved down its shoulder. The bull groaned, a deep, rattling sound. Her fingers found a spot, a small, swollen lump, almost hidden by the thick hide. "Here." She looked up at Quinn. "Did you move him from the south pasture this morning?" The young hand, Billy, nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. Me and Jed did. There's a patch of water hemlock near the creek there," Cora stated, not asked. "It's early for it, but the winter was mild. He's been poisoned. He needs oil, and he needs it now. A gallon, maybe more. It'll coat his stomach, slow the poison." The men just stared. The sour-faced one, Jed, scoffed. "Poison? That's full talk. It's bloat." But Quinn was not looking at Jed. He was looking at Cora. He was looking at the certainty in her eyes, the way her hands rested on his dying bull, not with pity, but with purpose. He saw a competence that was as stark and real as the mountains on the horizon. For the first time, a flicker of something other than doubt crossed his face. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was the desperate calculation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Get the oil," he barked at Billy, his voice rough. "Lard, linseed, whatever you can find. Now." The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos, directed entirely by the woman who had arrived with nothing but 2 carpet bags and a silent child. Cora showed them how to pry the bull's jaws open with a piece of wood, how to carefully pour the oil down its throat without choking it. She spoke in low, calm tones, her instructions precise and clear. She had Billy and the other hand, a quiet old man named Gus, help her rub the bull's legs to keep the circulation going. She never looked at Quinn for approval. She didn't need it. She was in her element, and the authority she commanded was born of pure, unassailable knowledge. Slowly, agonizingly, the bull's frantic breathing began to ease. The heaving of its chest lessened. After another hour, with the sun beginning to cast long shadows across the yard, the animal gave a great shudder and struggled, with the help of the men, to get its legs under it. It stood, swaying and unsteady, but it was on its feet. A collective sigh of relief went through the men. Cora stood up, wiping her oily, grimy hands on her already stained skirt. She was bone-tired, but a quiet satisfaction settled in her. She had done what she knew how to do. She turned and found Eamon Quinn watching her. His face was unreadable, the scar tissue around his eye stark in the fading light. He looked at the bull, now taking a shaky step. He looked at the boy, Billy, who was staring at Cora with open admiration. He looked at Jed, who was pointedly examining a fence post, refusing to acknowledge what had happened. Then his gaze returned to her. He walked over to where her bags still sat in the dust, a testament to her uncertain welcome. Alara was right beside them, a small, solitary figure who hadn't moved an inch. He stopped in front of Cora. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "The cook's quarters are behind the main house," he said, his voice still a rasp, but with some of the grinding edge gone. "They're not much. There's a cot for the girl." He paused, his gaze dropping to Alara for a fraction of a second. "Breakfast is at 5. Supper is at 6. You'll cook and clean. Keep the books. For 30 days. We'll see after that." He turned without waiting for a reply and walked back toward the house, his stride as stiff and uncompromising as before. It was not a welcome. It was a contract, a provisional truce. Cora watched him go. Then she bent down and picked up her bags, one in each hand. She walked over to her daughter and gently touched her shoulder. Alara looked up, her dark eyes searching her mother's face. Cora offered her a small, weary smile. It wasn't a home. Not yet. But it was a roof. And for tonight, that was enough. Clear's throat. The cook's quarters were exactly as he had described them. Not much. It was a single room, attached to the back of the main house, but accessible only by a separate, rickety door. It contained a narrow iron bed frame with a lumpy mattress, a small, three-legged table, one chair, and a crate for storage. Dust lay thick on every surface, and the air was stale with disuse. But it had a window that looked out over the vast, rolling expanse of the valley, and through the thin wall, she could hear the faint, steady ticking of a clock in the main house. It was the sound of a heart, however faint. Cora set to work immediately. It was her nature. Work was the only prayer she had left. While Alara sat on the single chair, her small doll clutched in her lap, Cora took the thin mattress outside and beat it until clouds of dust choked the air. She found a bucket and a rag and scrubbed the floorboards, the walls, the window pane. She used a corner of her own shawl to wipe down the little table. She worked with an unhurried, methodical rhythm, her motions economical and precise. There was no wasted energy, no frantic scrubbing. It was the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned that survival was a marathon, not a sprint. To Eamon Quinn, watching from the kitchen window of the main house, her movements seemed less like cleaning and more like a form of reclamation, as if she were patiently erasing the neglect, one steady wipe at a time. He turned away from the window, a strange and unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It was the territory right next to annoyance, but it wasn't quite that. He had granted her a 30-day reprieve out of a single, desperate moment. The bull, his prize bull that represented the last of his father's legacy, was alive because of her. He could not deny it. Jed could scoff and Gus could remain silent, but the fact of it stood in the corral, breathing steadily. Still, he resented the intrusion. He had built his life around a core of solitude, a fortress of low expectations and guarded silence. This woman, with her direct gaze and her unnerving competence, had breached the outer wall without even trying. The next morning, the men of the Flying Q Ranch woke to a smell they had long forgotten: baking bread. It was a warm, yeasty, wholesome scent that crept into the bunkhouse and wrapped around them like a promise. When they shuffled into the main house's kitchen, they found a different world. The long trestle table, usually sticky with the ghosts of last night's meal, was scrubbed clean. The pot-bellied stove gleamed, and on the table were stacks of hot biscuits, a platter of fried salt pork, and a pot of coffee that smelled rich and dark, not like the boiled-down chicory swill they were used to. Cora moved around the kitchen as if she had been born in it. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. She nodded a simple, "good morning," as the men entered but did not engage in chatter. Alara sat on a stool in the corner, away from the traffic of the men's boots, sketching on a piece of slate Cora had found for her. Billy, the young hand, was the first to react. He picked up a biscuit, broke it open, and watched the steam curl out. A slow, wondering smile spread across his face. "I'll be," he whispered, as if witnessing a miracle. Jed, the sour-faced hand, grunted. He took a biscuit, slathered it with sorghum, and ate it in 2 bites. "It's just bread," he muttered, but his eyes betrayed him. He took another one. Gus, the old man, simply nodded once in Cora's direction. It was a small gesture, but from Gus, it was the equivalent of a brass band parade. He ate his breakfast slowly, with a quiet reverence. Eamon Quinn was the last to enter. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. The clean room. The real food. The quiet industry of the woman at the stove. It was a domesticity so profound, so alien to the harsh, masculine world he inhabited, that it felt like a violation. He felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He wanted to find fault. He wanted to reassert the familiar misery of the place. But the smell of the coffee was undeniable, and the sight of his men eating a decent meal for the first time in months was a silent rebuke to his own long neglect. He took his seat at the head of the table, and Cora placed a plate in front of him. Biscuits, pork, and 2 perfectly fried eggs. He hadn't eaten an egg that wasn't hard-boiled in 5 years. He looked at the plate. He looked at Cora, who had already turned back to the stove. He looked at the child in the corner, who watched him with her huge, solemn eyes. He picked up his fork and ate. He did not say a word, but every bite was an admission of defeat, or perhaps something else entirely. The days fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons, but now underscored by the quiet, pervasive influence of Cora Halloran. The ranch house began to shed its skin of grime and despair. Curtains, sewn from bleached flour sacks, appeared in the windows. The men's mending pile, which had once been a mountain of torn shirts and split seams, slowly shrank. She wasted nothing. Leftover biscuits were turned into pudding. Pork fat was rendered into lard and soap. She moved through the ranch's decay like a careful gardener, weeding and tending, bringing order from chaos. Her presence was a quiet one, but her impact was seismic. The men's morale, long eroded by poor food and a general sense of hopelessness, began to mend itself, stitch by stitch, just like their shirts. Billy started whistling as he worked. Gus began to offer quiet bits of advice to the boy, his silence breaking in small, useful fragments. Only Jed remained resistant. He saw Cora's improvements not as a blessing but as a threat to the established order, a feminine intrusion into their rough-hewn world. "She's using too much flour," he complained to Quinn one evening, as they stood by the corral watching the herd. "We'll be out by Christmas at this rate. And eggs every morning? Who does she think we are? Kings?" Quinn looked at Jed, his scarred eye giving him a predatory air. "The men are working harder," he said, his voice flat. "Billy's put 10 pounds on. The books say we're spending less on supplies than we were 3 months ago. She's not wasting it." "It ain't right," Jed grumbled, kicking at a loose stone. "A woman running the house like she owns it. Telling us what to do." He was referring to the day before, when Cora had calmly instructed him to move a stack of firewood away from the house, explaining that it drew termites. Jed had bristled at being told what to do by a woman, but he had done it because the logic was unassailable. Quinn didn't answer. He was watching Cora through the kitchen window. She was at the table with Alara. She was teaching the girl to form letters on the slate. Her head was bent, the lamplight catching the soft curve of her neck. He saw not an intruder, but a strange, quiet strength. He remembered the feel of the account ledgers she had given him the night before. For the first time in years, they were balanced. Not just balanced, but organized. Legible. She had added a section at the back. Potential savings. It included notes on everything from the price of nails at a different supplier to the amount of grain lost to rats because of holes in the feed bin. He felt that strange stirring in his chest again. It was the feeling of a long-held burden beginning to shift, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to let it go. The confrontation with Jed came to a head a week later. It was over something small, as such things often are. A barrel of salted beef had been delivered, and Jed and Billy were moving it into the larder. "Put it in the back corner," Jed grunted, gesturing with his chin. Cora stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "If you put it there, you'll have to move those sacks of beans to get to the winter preserves," she said, her tone even and informative. "It should go here." She pointed to an empty space near the door. "First in, first out. That way nothing spoils." Jed straightened up, his face darkening. He had been looking for a fight, a way to reassert his place in the pecking order. This was it. "I've been stocking this larder since before you showed your face here, Mrs. I know where the beef goes." "You've been stocking it wrong," Cora replied, without a trace of malice. It was a simple statement of fact. "We threw out 20 pounds of bacon last week because it had gone rancid behind the flour sacks." "Are you calling me a liar?" Jed took a step toward her, his posture belligerent. Billy looked on, his face pale and anxious. Cora did not take a step back. She held her ground, her gaze steady. She was holding a heavy cast-iron skillet, which she had been about to clean. She didn't lift it, didn't brandish it as a weapon. She just held it, its weight a solid, comforting presence in her hand. I am saying that there is a right way and a wrong way to stock a pantry. I am saying that waste is something this ranch cannot afford. If you want to call that an insult, that is your business. Now, the barrel goes here. The air was thick with unspoken challenge. Jed's hands had clenched into fists. He was bigger than her, stronger. But he was faced with something he didn't know how to fight. Calm, unshakable reason. Is there a problem here? The question came from the doorway. Eamon Quinn stood there, his shadow falling long across the larder floor. He had been in the small office off the kitchen, going over the very ledgers Cora had prepared. He had heard the entire exchange. Jed turned, a triumphant look on his face. She's trying to tell me how to do my job, boss. Overstepping. Quinn's gaze moved from Jed's angry face to Cora's calm one. He looked at the skillet in her hand, noting that it was held loosely, not as a threat. He looked at the space she had indicated, and his mind, now accustomed to her relentless logic, immediately saw the sense in it. He thought of the rancid bacon. He thought of the balanced books. He thought of the clean house and the warm bread. She's right, Quinn said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Put the barrel where she told you. From now on, the house, the larder, and the stores are her domain. You will follow her instructions in those matters as if they were my own. Jed's face fell. The color drained from it, replaced by a mottled red of pure humiliation. He stared at Quinn, then at Cora. Without another word, he and Billy manhandled the heavy barrel to the spot Cora had chosen. The silence was deafening. Quinn watched them for a moment longer, then turned and went back into his office, closing the door behind him. Cora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The skillet suddenly felt very heavy. She had won, but it was a victory that felt precarious. She had been validated, but she was still an outsider, her position dependent on the shifting moods of a scarred and broken man. She looked at Jed, who refused to meet her eye. She had not made an enemy, she realized. She had simply revealed one that was already there. And she had gained something far more important, a foothold. It wasn't solid ground yet, but it was no longer shifting sand. A few nights later, after the supper dishes were cleared and the men had retired to the bunkhouse, Cora sat at the kitchen table, working by the light of a single oil lamp. The ranch's account books were spread before her. For a week, in the quiet hours after Alara was asleep, she had been meticulously going through the past 3 years of receipts and ledgers. It was a tangle of chaotic entries, faded ink, and sloppy arithmetic. But Cora, whose mind found a strange peace in the order of numbers, was patient. She had started the task to get a better sense of the ranch's expenditures, but she had quickly uncovered something more troubling. The invoices from the main supplier in the nearest town, a man named Henderson, were a mess. The prices for grain, salt, and basic provisions seemed to fluctuate wildly, always on an upward trend. She found receipts from 2 years ago for flour at $2 a barrel, and recent ones for $3.50. There was no drought, no shortage that would account for such an increase. More than that, she noticed subtler things. The weight of delivered goods was often recorded in a hasty scrawl, but when she cross-referenced it with the expected yield from the ranch's own small garden or herd, the numbers didn't add up. There were phantoms in the accounts. Tonight, she had found the proof. Tucked into the back of the 1886 ledger was a folded, forgotten price list from a different supplier, the Mercantile in Stone Creek, a town some 30 miles further east. The paper was brittle, but the figures were clear. Even accounting for the extra freight costs, Henderson's prices were, on average, 30% higher. Systematically, consistently higher. For 3 years. She began to calculate, her pencil scratching softly in the quiet room. She figured the total tonnage of flour, the barrels of salt, the crates of tinned goods. The numbers grew, piling up into a sum that made her stomach tighten. It was over $400. To a prosperous ranch, a nuisance. To the Flying Q, it was a hemorrhage. It was the price of a new bull, a new roof for the barn, wages for another hand. It was the difference between holding on and going under. Henderson wasn't just a bad businessman. He was a thief, slowly and methodically bleeding the ranch dry. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Eamon Quinn stood in the kitchen doorway. He often roamed the house at night, a restless ghost in his own home. He had seen the light under her door and had come to investigate, a familiar scowl of suspicion on his face. "You're burning my oil," he said. It was his default language, accusation. Cora didn't look up from her work. "I'm saving you money," she replied, her voice even. She pushed the ledger across the table toward him. "Your supplier, Henderson, has been robbing you blind for at least 3 years." He walked to the table and stood over her, looking down at the columns of figures. He picked up the brittle price list from the Stone Creek Mercantile, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle with the fragile paper. He read it, then looked back at Cora's neat, damning calculations. He traced the final figure with his index finger. $417. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, a sound Cora was coming to associate with the slow, arduous process of this man's thoughts. She expected anger and explosion. She expected him to blame her for uncovering a failure that was ultimately his own. Instead, he pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. The movement was heavy, weary. He stared at the numbers, but she had the sense he was looking at something far beyond them, at a long history of mistakes and misplaced trust. "The man who kept the books before," Quinn said, his voice low and gravelly, almost a whisper. "He was my wife's cousin. After she died, I let him handle things. The town side of things. I never liked it. The numbers. I trusted him." He paused. "He left 2 years ago. Said he'd found a better prospect in California. He took my horse and my wife's silver." Cora listened, her pencil still in her hand. This was the most he had ever said to her, to anyone, as far as she could tell. It wasn't an apology, but it was an explanation, a confession. It was the story behind the scar, not the one on his face, but the deeper one that kept him locked in silence. Betrayal was the poison he'd been nursing, and Henderson was just another symptom of the disease. Henderson was his friend, Quinn added, the pieces clicking into place with grim satisfaction. They were likely in it together. "We can switch to the Stone Creek supplier," Cora said, her voice practical, pulling him back from the past. "I've calculated the freight. We'd still save over $100 a year. And I can write to Henderson, questioning the invoices. We won't see the money back, but it will put him on notice that the arrangement is over." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her clear eyes, the capable set of her hands. He saw the woman who had saved his bull, faced down his most belligerent hand, and now had uncovered a rot at the core of his livelihood. She hadn't done it for praise. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, because order was her creed and waste was her enemy. She was not just a cook. She was not just a housekeeper. She was a partner. The realization settled in him not with a jolt, but with the slow, quiet weight of truth. From her room, a small cry broke the silence. "Alara." She was having a nightmare. Cora was on her feet in an instant, her chair scraping back. She murmured a quiet apology and disappeared into the back of the house. Quinn remained at the table, staring at the empty chair. He could hear the soft murmur of her voice, a language he didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. It was the sound of comfort, of safety. A few minutes later, Cora returned, carrying Alara in her arms. The child was wrapped in a quilt, her face tear-streaked and buried in her mother's shoulder, but she was no longer crying. She was hiccuping softly, her small body trembling. "A bad dream," Cora said simply. She made to take Alara back to her own cold room, but the child stirred, her sleepy eyes fixing on the warm glow of the fire in the main hearth. She murmured something, a soft, guttural word in her native Polish, and pointed a small finger toward the flames. Quinn found himself speaking before he had thought it through. "Let her be," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's warmer in here." Cora hesitated, surprised. She looked at his face, at the hard lines etched by suspicion and pain, and saw something new in the depths of his gray eyes. A crack in the fortress wall. She slowly walked to the hearth and sat down on the worn rug, settling Alara in her lap. The child sighed, her body relaxing in the radiant warmth. She watched the flames dance, her earlier fear melting away. Quinn didn't return to his office. He remained at the table, watching them. He watched as Cora began to hum a soft, foreign lullaby. He watched as Alara's eyelids grew heavy. And he watched as, finally, the child slipped from her mother's lap and curled up on the rug by the hearth, one small hand tucked under her cheek, fast asleep in the firelight. The sight of the sleeping child in the heart of his desolate house did something to him that no amount of logic or reason ever could. It was a profound and aching innocence. It was life. It was a future he had long ago given up on. He looked at Cora, who was watching her daughter with an expression of fierce, gentle love. He looked at the peaceful rise and fall of Alara's chest. "My wife," he began, and the sound of his own voice startled him. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. Her name was Eleanor. She planted the roses by the porch. "They haven't bloomed since she's been gone." He stopped, the silence rushing back in. He felt exposed, stripped bare by the simple admission. Cora did not offer empty platitudes. She did not say she was sorry for his loss. She simply nodded, accepting the confidence for what it was, a key, offered to a locked room. "Alara's father planted a garden for her," she said softly, her gaze still on the fire. "Hollyhocks. She loved to hide among them. They were taller than she was." They sat that way for nearly an hour, in a quiet companionship forged by shared loss and the sleeping form of a child. For the first time, the house did not feel empty. It felt occupied. Quinn looked from the balanced ledgers on his table to the capable woman before the fire, to the innocent child sleeping by his hearth. The cold, hard knot of grief and betrayal that he had carried in his chest for so long began to loosen, just a fraction. It was a terrifying, unfamiliar feeling. It felt like hope, and it had been brought here in 2 worn carpet bags by a woman with nothing left to sell. Music. The change in Eamon Quinn was not a sudden thaw, but a slow, geological shift. The hard permafrost of his demeanor began to recede, exposing patches of something softer beneath. He started speaking in full sentences. He would ask Billy about his progress with a Greenbroke colt, or comment to Gus on the look of the sky. He even, on one occasion, addressed a remark directly to Alara, holding out a curiously shaped stone he'd found. "Looks like a bird," he'd rumbled. Alara had taken it without a word, her solemn eyes studying it, before tucking it into the pocket of her dress, a silent treasure. He began to consult Cora on matters that went far beyond the kitchen and the larder. He would unroll a map of the ranch on the kitchen table after supper and ask her opinion on pasture rotation. He'd bring her a piece of broken tack, and they would discuss the best way to repair it. He was not just using her knowledge anymore. He was seeking her counsel. The men noticed. Jed's grumbling subsided into a resentful silence. Billy and Gus saw it for what it was, the forging of a partnership. The 30-day trial period came and went, unmentioned by either of them. It had become irrelevant. Cora was no longer a temporary fixture. She was part of the structure, as essential as the beams holding up the barn. But as the life inside the ranch began to mend, the threat from outside coiled tighter. Silas Croft was a man who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned. He was their nearest neighbor to the west, though near, in this country, meant 10 miles of rock and scrub. His own ranch was prosperous, built on shrewd deals and a kind of patient, predatory ambition. He had been circling the flying Q for years, like a coyote waiting for a sick calf to drop. He had made Quinn offers, all of them insultingly low, which Quinn had always refused out of pure, stubborn pride. Croft had been watching. He'd seen the new life on the flying Q. He'd heard in town that Quinn's prize bull, which he'd thought was a goner, was not only alive but had sired 3 new calves. He saw the subtle signs of repair, the straightening of a fence line, the patch on the bunkhouse roof. He saw the ranch moving not toward collapse, but toward recovery, and he knew it was time to act. The blow came on a hot, dry Tuesday in late August. A rider brought the letter from the county seat. It was an official-looking document, full of legal language. It was an injunction. Silas Croft, it stated, was claiming sole ownership of the water rights to Blue Creek, the primary source of water for the Flying Q's herds and house. The claim was based on a resurvey he had commissioned, which, he alleged, proved the original survey from 1850 was faulty and that the creek's headwaters lay entirely on his property. Until the matter could be settled by the circuit judge, who wasn't due for another 2 months, Quinn was legally forbidden from drawing any water from the creek. Eamon read the document twice, his face turning the color of ash. The words blurred before his eyes. Blue Creek was the lifeblood of the ranch. The secondary sources, a few small springs in the high pastures, would be dry within a week in this heat. Without the creek, his cattle would die. The ranch would die. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an execution. He looked out the window, across the parched, brown land, toward the thin, shimmering line of green that marked the path of the creek. His creek. His father's creek. He had been born on this land. He had learned to swim in that water. He had scattered his wife's ashes on its banks. And now Silas Croft, with a piece of paper and a hired surveyor, was going to take it away. All the progress of the last few months, all the fragile hope that Cora had so painstakingly cultivated, crumbled to dust. The old, familiar despair washed over him, cold and complete. He felt the scar on his face tighten, the old wound aching as if it were fresh. This was the world he knew. A world where everything you built, everything you loved, was eventually taken from you. Betrayal by a friend was one thing. This was a betrayal by the law, by the very lines on the map that were supposed to mean something. He slumped into his chair in the office, the injunction notice trembling in his hand. He didn't call for Cora. He didn't tell the men. He just sat there, hollowed out, as the afternoon sun beat down on a ranch that had just been served its death warrant. He was trapped. Croft had him, and he knew it. The fight was over before it had even begun. He stared at the wall, at a faded photograph of his father, a hard, unsmiling man, and felt a shame so profound it was like a physical sickness. He had failed. Cora found him there an hour later. She had come to ask him about an order of winter wool, but she stopped in the doorway, seeing the look on his face. She had seen that look once before, in the mirror, on the day the banker had told her she had lost everything. It was the look of a person who had fallen from a great height and had not yet hit the ground, but knew, with absolute certainty, that they would. "Amen," she said softly. He didn't look at her. He just held out the paper. She took it and read it, her brow furrowing as she deciphered the dense legal text. Her face remained impassive, but her mind was racing. She understood the implications immediately and completely. It was a brilliant, vicious move. A checkmate. She looked at the man in the chair, at the utter defeat in the slump of his shoulders. The Eamon Quinn of 2 months ago would have met this with rage, with a furious, futile lashing out. This man was simply broken. He had allowed himself to hope, and the universe had punished him for it. She knew that feeling. She knew the temptation to simply lie down and let the end come. But Cora Halloran had long ago decided she was not the lying down kind. She placed the injunction on the desk. "Where are the old deeds?" she asked, her voice calm and practical. "The original homestead papers. Everything you have." He looked up at her, his eyes dull. "What's the use? It's over. He has a new survey. He has the law on his side." "The law is a story written on paper," Cora said, her voice sharp with an intensity that cut through his fog of despair. "Croft has written his version. We need to find ours." She walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was firm, not gentle. It was not a gesture of pity, it was a summons. "I will not lose another home, Eamon. Not this one. Now, where are the papers?" Her resolve, her absolute refusal to accept defeat, was like a splash of cold water. It didn't cure his despair, but it shocked him out of his paralysis. He stared at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes. She was not his employee. She was not his cook. In that moment, she was his general. He gestured vaguely toward a large, dusty trunk in the corner of the office. "In there? My father's papers. My grandfather's," he said it with a tone of dismissal, as if it were a tomb filled with nothing but ghosts. "Good," she said, already moving toward it. "You will tell the men what has happened. Tell them we are not beaten. Have Billy and Gus start moving the herd to the north pasture. There's a spring there. It's not much, but it will buy us a day. Maybe 2. Tell Jed to check the well by the house. We'll need every drop for ourselves. Do not let them see you despair. They will take their cue from you." She looked back at him, her gaze pinning him to his chair. "And you will take your cue from me." With that, she knelt before the trunk, lifted the heavy lid, and plunged her hands into the dusty, brittle history of the Flying Q Ranch. She was not asking for permission. She was not waiting for hope to appear. She was, as always, simply starting the work that needed to be done. The office was dark save for the golden rectangle of light thrown by a single lamp. Outside, the world was a canvas of deep indigo and silver, the moon hanging fat and bright in a sky full of stars. Inside, Cora was surrounded by a sea of paper. For hours, she had sat on the floor, sorting through the contents of the old trunk. It was a lifetime's worth of history. Brittle deeds, yellowed maps, letters bound in faded ribbon, tax receipts, and journals filled with the spidery script of men long dead. The air was thick with the scent of dust and time. She worked with the same methodical patience she applied to everything. She sorted the documents into piles: legal, financial, personal. She was looking for a single word, a forgotten clause, a landmark that Silas Croft's hired surveyor might have missed or deliberately ignored. She knew it was a fool's errand. Croft was not a stupid man. He would have been thorough, but her late husband used to say that the past always leaves a trail. You just have to be willing to walk it. Eamon had done as she'd asked. He had gathered the men, his voice tight but steady, and explained the situation. He had laid out Cora's plan to conserve water. To his surprise, the men hadn't panicked. Billy had just nodded, his young face set with determination. Gus had spat and said, "Croft's a snake. Always has been." Even Jed, after a moment's hesitation, had given a curt nod. "The well's deep," he'd said. "It'll hold for a bit." Their quiet resolve was a reflection of the change Cora had wrought. They were no longer just hired hands on a failing ranch. They were a unit, a garrison under siege. Now, Eamon stood in the doorway of the office, watching her. He had been there for half an hour, unseen. He watched her slender fingers sift through the fragile papers of his family's past. She handled them with a strange reverence, as if she were touching something sacred. He had never looked in this trunk. For him, it held only the weight of expectation and failure. For her, it held answers. She was on her knees, leaning over a large, hand-drawn map from the original 1850 homestead claim. It was cruder than the official survey maps, the lines drawn with a less certain hand. But it was rich with detail. The cartographer, Eamon's great-uncle, had been a naturalist, and he had sketched in landmarks. The Standing Stones, Hawk's Nest Ridge, Wolf Hollow. These were the old names, the names Eamon's father had used, names that had fallen out of fashion. What was the witness tree? Cora asked, without looking up. Eamon stepped into the room. What? She pointed to a spot on the map. A tiny, elegant drawing of a massive oak tree stood right on the property line, near the headwaters of the creek. Beside it were the words, "Witness Tree, J.Q. 1850, the survey refers to it. The western boundary shall run north from the granite outcrop to the great oak known as the Witness Tree, thence east along the ridge." It was a legal marker. Eamon shook his head, a bitter taste in his mouth. It's gone. Struck by lightning 20, maybe 30 years ago. There's nothing there now but a stump, and even that's mostly rotted away. Croft knows that. His new survey is based on magnetic north from the outcrop. It's a more modern and accurate method, he claims. It's how he moved the line 100 yards east and put the creek on his land. Cora fell silent. She stared at the drawing of the tree. It was the linchpin of the original claim, and it was gone. Croft had found the perfect loophole. He had replaced a physical, immutable fact with an abstract, contestable one. She let out a soft sigh and leaned back on her heels, the first sign of weariness she had shown all day. The lamp cast shadows across her face, highlighting the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. For a moment, the sheer impossibility of their situation seemed to settle in the room. But then her eyes drifted to another pile of documents, the personal letters. On top was a thin bundle tied with a blue ribbon. The letters of Eamon's grandmother, Eleanor Quinn, the one who had planted the roses. Cora felt a strange impulse. This wasn't logic. It wasn't accounting. It was something else, a hunch born of desperation. She picked up the bundle and carefully untied the ribbon. The letters were mostly to her sister in Ohio. They spoke of the hardships of ranch life, the birth of her son, Eamon's father, the harsh winters, the brief, glorious springs. Cora scanned them quickly, her eyes searching for anything, any mention of the land. And then she found it. It was in a letter dated June 1852. Eleanor was describing a picnic she had taken with her husband to celebrate their second anniversary. "We laid our blanket in the shade of the great witness tree," she read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet room. John laughed and said it was the most important resident of the whole ranch, as it held our fortune in its roots. He showed me where, as a boy, He and his brother had hammered a railroad spike deep into the trunk on the east-facing side, to mark it as their own private castle. Cora stopped reading. She looked up at Eamon. His face was a mask of confusion. A railroad spike. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice flat with disappointment. The tree is gone, Cora. The tree is gone, she agreed, her voice suddenly alive with a new energy. But a railroad spike hammered into the heartwood of an ancient oak. Eamon, what happens to iron when it's buried in the ground for 40 years? He stared at her, the gears of his mind slowly turning, catching on this new, unbelievable thread of thought. Iron. In the ground. For decades. It rusts, he whispered. It rusts, she confirmed, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, and it was like watching the sun rise. It leaches into the soil. An iron spike in an oak stump, rotting for 30 years. What would that do to the ground around it? The realization dawned on him, a staggering, impossible bolt of lightning in the darkness of his despair. He thought of the high iron content in some of the region's springs, how it stained the creek beds a telltale orange-red. It would poison the soil, he breathed. Nothing would grow. Or the things that did grow would be stained with it. Cora was already on her feet, grabbing the lamp. Get a shovel, she said, her voice ringing with triumph. And get Billy. We're going for a walk. They reached the site of the old oak just as the first hint of dawn was breaking the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. The air was cool and carried the scent of sage. The place was just as Eamon had described, a low, rounded mound of rotting wood and dark earth, barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. It was a grave, a forgotten landmark. Billy stood by with 2 shovels, his face a mixture of confusion and sleepy excitement. Eamon held the lantern high, its light cutting a weak circle in the growing twilight. He felt a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with the morning chill. It was the fragile, terrifying flutter of hope. Croft's surveyors would have seen the stump, Cora said, her voice low and focused as she surveyed the ground. They would have dismissed it as irrelevant. They were looking for a tree. They weren't looking for its ghost. She handed the lamp to Eamon and took a shovel. She didn't start digging at the stump itself. Instead, she began to walk the perimeter, her eyes scanning the ground, looking for a sign, any sign. The earth was dry and cracked. Sparse clumps of buffalo grass and thistle grew here and there. It all looked the same. Eamon's brief flare of hope began to gutter. It had been a foolish, desperate idea, a story found in a dead woman's letter. But Cora did not give up. She moved with the patience of water, of time itself. She circled the stump once, then twice. Then she stopped. She knelt down, her fingers brushing away the loose topsoil from a small, struggling patch of grass. Unlike the pale green and brown of the surrounding vegetation, this patch was sickly. Its blades were stunted, and they carried a faint but unmistakable stain along their edges. The color of rust. Here, she whispered. She looked up at Eamon, her eyes shining in the lantern light. On the east-facing side. He moved to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw it too. It was almost nothing, a detail so small and insignificant that anyone not looking for it would have passed it by 1,000 times. But it was there. The ghost of the iron spike, written in the language of sick grass. Dig, she said, her voice tight with anticipation. Eamon took the other shovel and plunged it into the earth beside the stained grass. The ground was hard, packed clay and roots. He and Billy took turns, their digging punctuated by the grunt of effort and the scrape of metal on stone. Cora held the lamp, her presence a steady, unwavering beacon. They dug for 20 minutes, the hole growing deeper. Eamon's hope began to fade again, replaced by the familiar ache of disappointment. It was nothing, a coincidence. And then, Billy's shovel struck something with a dull, metallic thud. It was not the sound of stone. Wait, Eamon breathed. He fell to his knees and reached into the hole, his hands scrabbling in the cool, dark earth. His fingers closed around something hard, cylindrical, and heavily corroded. He pulled it free. It was a railroad spike. It was pitted and scaled with a thick crust of orange rust, but its shape was undeniable. It was heavy in his hand, a solid, tangible piece of the past. He looked at it, lying in his palm. He looked at the hole in the ground, located precisely where the east-facing side of the great oak would have been. He looked at Cora, her face illuminated by the rising sun, and he felt a profound and overwhelming wave of emotion. It was gratitude, it was admiration, it was awe. He didn't say anything. He just held it out for her to see. She reached out and touched it, her fingers tracing the rusted metal. "The most important resident of the ranch," she quoted softly. The climax was not a shootout at high noon. It was something far more satisfying. The next morning, Eamon Quinn, accompanied by Cora and Billy, rode not to Silas Croft's ranch, but to the small settlement of Crossroads, where the circuit judge, a formidable man named Elias Thorne, was known to take his breakfast at the town's only hotel. They found him there. Croft was with him, the two of them sharing coffee, Croft's face smug and confident. He was clearly poisoning the well, presenting his side of the story before Quinn even had a chance. Croft's smile faltered when he saw Quinn walk in, not looking defeated, but calm and resolute. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Cora Halloran walk in beside him. "Judge Thorne," Eamon said, his voice steady and clear. He ignored Croft completely. "I believe you have an injunction notice regarding my property, the Flying Q." Judge Thorne, a man with a face like a weathered gavel, nodded slowly. "I do, Mr. Quinn. A serious matter. Water rights are the foundation of this territory." "Indeed they are," Eamon agreed. "And so are property lines. Mr. Croft here has based his claim on a new survey, which dismisses the primary landmark of the original 1850 homestead deed, the witness tree, on the grounds that the tree is no longer standing." Croft spoke up, his voice smooth and condescending. "The law must adapt to the land, Eamon. A modern survey is more reliable than a rotted stump. But the law," Cora said, stepping forward slightly, "is also based on intent. The intent of the original survey is clear." She placed the old, hand-drawn map on the table in front of the judge. "The boundary was marked by that tree. The tree may be gone, but its location is not." She then unwrapped a small cloth and placed the rusted railroad spike on the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "What is that?" the judge asked, peering at it. "That," Eamon said, "is a railroad spike. It was driven into the east-facing trunk of the witness tree in the spring of 1852, according to a letter from my grandmother." He placed Eleanor's letter beside the spike. "After 40 years in the ground, it has left a clear and undeniable trace of iron in the soil, precisely where the tree once stood. A trace that has stained the vegetation. Mr. Croft's surveyor was looking for a tree. He wasn't looking for its ghost. We were." The judge picked up the spike, weighing it in his hand. He looked at the map, at the letter, and then at Silas Croft. Croft's face had gone pale. The smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by the pinched look of a man who has overplayed his hand and knows it. He had built his case on a modern abstraction, and they had defeated him with a rusty piece of iron and a dead woman's letter. They had found a truth in the ground that was more powerful than his truth on paper. Judge Thorne put the spike down. He looked at Croft for a long, silent moment. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I find it highly unlikely that a man as familiar with this territory as you are was unaware of the history of that landmark. This injunction is dissolved, effective immediately, and I would advise you to think very carefully about the legal definition of perjury before you bring any more such claims before my court." Silas Croft stood up, his chair scraping loudly. He looked at Eamon, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. But then his gaze shifted to Cora, and he saw the calm, intelligent woman who had unraveled his entire scheme. He saw the architect of his defeat. Without a word, he turned and stormed out of the hotel. His power was broken, not by a gun, but by history, by a woman's patient mind and a man's rediscovered courage. His reputation in the county, built on a veneer of shrewdness, would be forever tarnished by this public, intellectual humiliation. Clear's throat. The ride back to the Flying Q was quiet. The sun was high and warm. The land no longer seemed threatening, but full of a rugged, enduring beauty. Eamon rode beside Cora, the silence between them comfortable, alive with unspoken understanding. He kept stealing glances at her, at the calm profile of her face as she looked out at the familiar hills. She had saved him. She had saved his home, his legacy. She had given him back a future he thought was long buried. They did not speak of it until that evening. The men were celebrating in the bunkhouse, the sound of a harmonica drifting on the cool night air. Alara was asleep. The small stone Eamon had given her clutched in her hand. Cora was at the kitchen table, mending one of Billy's shirts, her hands moving with their usual steady grace. Eamon entered the kitchen and stood for a moment, just watching her. The house was clean. It was warm. It smelled of baking bread and lemon oil. It smelled like a home. He walked to the table and sat down across from her. "My father," he began, his voice low. "He used to say this ranch demanded everything a man had. His sweat, his blood, his spirit. He said if you gave it any less, it would break you." He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of work. "I think he was wrong. I think the ranch doesn't want everything a man has. I think it just wants the one thing he can't give it alone." Cora stopped sewing. She looked at him, her expression patient, waiting. "It wants a heart," he said, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. "This place has been a body without a heart for a long time. Just bones and muscle, going through the motions. You changed that." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, the one holding the needle. His touch was hesitant, but warm. "The 30 days are long past, Cora. This morning, in front of the judge, you said you wouldn't lose another home. I don't want you to." He took a breath, the words coming hard, forged in the fire of his long-held solitude. "This is not a proposal of employment. This is a proposal of partnership. In the ranch. In everything. I am asking you to stay. Not as my cook, but as my partner. To make this your home. For good." Cora looked down at his hand covering hers. She saw the scars, the calluses, the strength in it. She thought of her arrival, a desperate woman with nothing but her own competence and a silent child. She had come seeking shelter, a temporary harbor. She had not expected to find a place to anchor her soul. She had come to survive, but she had, against all odds, built a life. She looked around the warm, quiet kitchen, at the steady flame of the lamp, and she knew she was already home. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word, but it held the weight of all her journeys, all her losses, and all her newfound hope. The final scene is one of profound and earned peace. A month later, snow has fallen, blanketing the high country in a pristine layer of white. Inside the Flying Q Ranch house, the fire crackles in the hearth, its light dancing on the warm wooden walls. Eamon Quinn sits on the floor by the fire, the rusted railroad spike sitting on the mantelpiece above him like a holy relic. He is patiently showing Alara how to carve a small bird from a piece of scrap pine. The girl is leaning against his side, watching his large, scarred hands move with surprising delicacy. She still doesn't speak much, but a small, contented smile plays on her lips. She points to the bird and whispers a single, clear word. "Tack." Eamon smiles, a real, unguarded smile that softens the harsh lines of his face. "Bird," he repeats gently. "Bird." Across the room, Cora stands at the large kitchen table, her hands covered in flour as she kneads a heavy mound of dough for the morning's bread. Her movements are strong and sure, the rhythmic push and fold of familiar comfort. She watches Eamon and her daughter, a deep, quiet joy settling in her chest. The house is filled with the warm, yeasty scent of rising dough, the smell of life and sustenance. The ticking clock on the mantelpiece no longer sounds faint or lonely. It is the steady, reassuring heartbeat of a home, whole and alive. The Flying Q Ranch had been a place of survival, a fortress of solitude waiting for its final defeat. It had braced itself for a fight it could not win. What it got instead was a quiet woman and a silent child. What it got was the heart that made it a home.